And they're getting it recorded for us. Perfect. Hello, everybody. Thank you for making the time to join me today. I am the founder of Purebred Mini Jersey Society, and it was started based on the idea that miniature jerseys could be miniaturized Jersey cows. I thought that's what everybody was doing. I was really shocked a few years ago, it's really fairly recently still, to find out that a lot of people were just breeding small cattle that happened to be part Jersey. I was coming into homesteading about 12 years ago and did all my research and felt like jerseys were the cows for me. And I bought a couple of small standard jerseys, not even realizing how small they really were, because they felt huge to me. The biggest animal I'd had prior to that was a cat. So, of course, cows felt giant, right? And then it was later that I learned about mini jerseys, and I bought our first one, and she felt really small, and she was, but I never knew that she wasn't actually a miniaturized jersey because that's, I assumed they're called mini jerseys, right? Later on in our breeding program, probably about 7 years ago, I had a conversation with someone who said, oh no, mini jerseys aren't actually miniaturized jerseys. They just have jersey in them and whatever else you want to put in there. It could be Galloway, Lowline, Zebu, mini Hereford I've seen on some of the registrations from some other registries. And I was pretty shocked because although I love my mutts, I wanted my cow to perform in a certain way. I wanted her to have certain qualities and traits, and that's why I chose that breed. And I kept trying to figure out how do I know if I'm actually working with miniature jerseys or miniaturized jerseys? And it got very frustrating because every time I would go to the American Jersey Cattle Association and ask them about testing, I was told that mini jerseys aren't really jerseys and that they couldn't test. But it seemed like common sense to me that all Jersey genetics come from the Isle of Jersey. So I should be able to measure that in my mini jersey and figure out how close I was to actually having a jersey. So after a lot of failed attempts and a lot of wasted money and ordering the wrong tests, I nailed it and I figured it out. And then the next one, it was a little easier to do the testing because I knew what to order. And like Corey was talking about earlier, you know, what to fill in the different blanks to get it to actually be accepted, because you have to get them into AJCA and registered. So you have that number so you can send it through and order the genomics. So there's all these steps. And up until now, I've asked everyone to call me, to talk to me, to spend time on the phone with me so I could explain it to you. But as we are getting bigger, we've grown a board. So we've got a board of directors now, and they know how to test. So there's more of us that are doing it, but I want to get this information into everyone's hands so you can start helping your friends and your fellow breeders, because we need each other. We need more genetics. We need to be able to have bulls from other herds to bring in so that we don't end up breeding cows that are too closely related. And that's another premise for starting PMJS, is that I felt like there was a lot of negativity around mini jerseys, a lot of competition and that kind of competitive attitude. But I don't understand how we're supposed to do this if we aren't working together. Um, that just seems silly to me. So I want to show you guys how to do the testing so you can show other people how to do the testing. And so this is being recorded with the intention that it's going to be uploaded on YouTube for PMJS, and that we will have this as a resource so that we can share it as we move forward, and more people can understand that there is a way to access that DNA testing to figure out how much mini jersey is in our mini jersey, how much is really jersey. So the handout that I created that I've uploaded to you in the chat there, it talks about there are 3 different kinds of testing. So there's been a lot of confusion about that because there are multiple different places, unfortunately, for us to have to access to be able to get all of those answers that we want. So when we're talking about the types of testing, there's genetic traits, which are things like the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, how tall you're going to be, which is important to us when we're talking about stature for our cattle. Those are things that are predetermined by your genes, things that you can't change about yourself. And we want to know some of those things about our cattle. So if you want to know the A2 milk protein that your cows carry, that's the kind of testing that we're talking about. Polled, those are things just like your eye color. You can't change. You can take the horns off, but those genetics are still there. So those are genetic trait testing. And we'll talk about, you can access those usually through UC Davis. And then genomics, when we start talking about that, it's actually quite a bit different than your genetic traits. Genomics is a newer science, and that's what we're trying to access when we want to know how much Jersey DNA is in our miniaturized jerseys. So that is talking about not just looking at a specific gene and its location on the DNA strand, but it's actually looking at multiple genes and how those come together to create a bigger picture. I guess in the terms of like looking at your house, you can look at the house plan, right? But it doesn't actually give you that 3D perception of what it's like to walk through that house. And that's kind of what the genomics does for us. It puts it all into, it flushes it out. It puts it all into a form where we can actually see more about that cow. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get down into the genomics section about how they are using indexes, which is a combination of different genes to make educated guess, essentially. And then there's disease testing. And I think a lot of us are already familiar with that because we want to make sure that the milk that we're drinking, we're feeding our family is safe. So those tests, some of them have the federal government is regulating. So for something to test like for brucellosis or TB, you need a vet to be able to do that. But there are some tests that we can access on our own for a lot less expensive through different labs around the country. So those would be the disease testing that we're talking about to make sure our cow's healthy, or if we're having some trouble, maybe she's off feed or something, we're trying to figure out what's going on. So those are what the disease testing would be. So essentially there's 3 kinds of tests that we're going to utilize for our herds. So going down here to the genetic traits, when we're talking about things like the A2 milk and the eye color, UC Davis Veterinary Genetics Lab has the ability to do those kinds of tests. So you would take a hair sample, you go onto their website, you take a hair sample, which is from the tail. Those have to have the root bulb on the end, and you mail it in. You order it online, you mail it in, and they can come back and tell you all kinds of things about your cow that you can't just see with your naked eye. There's a few tests that are required to register with PMJS because a lot of times our miniature jerseys are crossed with some Dexter, which is used to bring the height down in earlier generations. There may be something called bulldog dwarfism, chondrodysplasia, which is essentially it's dwarfism that shrinks the bones, and sometimes they're missing cartilage or the cartilage is deformed. So because that is a genetic defect, that is something that we don't want to bring into our herds and into our cattle. We test for that so that those animals don't gain registration, spreading their genetics, because it's not ideal. A lot of times they suffer from early arthritis and quite a bit of pain. So the bulldog test is required, and then we also require parentage genetic marker report match. So what that does is that maps the animal's DNA so that it's just like when you're, you know, Maury Povich and they're doing the baby daddy kind of tests. That's what this is. They're going to map all of that DNA and have a picture of what that is, and then they match it to the parents. And I helped Corey with this the other day. You can lay it next to the dam or next to the sire, and you go down each genetic marker and you match. Does it go to the parent? Does it go to the dam? Does it go to the sire? And it has to match all the way through. If there's not enough matches, then UC Davis will tell you that it doesn't match and that that's not a possible sire. It's pretty fascinating how they're able to do that, but it is possible if you need to, like we did in Corey's situation, to be able to register. You can do it yourself if those parents are mapped. So if they're not mapped, they're not in the database, they can't be matched. UC Davis does not have the ability at this time to find a missing sire or dam. But for example, that very first mini that I bought, they didn't know who her sire or dam were. They thought they knew who the dam was, but they weren't sure. The cows had passed hands a couple of different times. So I did what I could in researching and then hit a wall, and there was several possible sires. So I tested UC Davis, and I think you can do up to 3 sires at a time. So you get that mapping of the animal, and if those other animals are in the database, you can test against them up to 3 potential sires or dams. So that's what we did. Unfortunately, in her situation, we were not able to find a match. They said it was a familial match, meaning that they were related, but a lot of our mini jerseys are related, so it wasn't a direct parental match. There are optional tests you can get at UC Davis, things like the A2 that we talked about, polled. With the polled, you might find that they are polled Celtic or polled Frisian. And what that means is that the Celtic breeds, things like Galloway, Lowline, or Friesian would be things like Holstein. Jersey is considered in the Friesian family. So when you see an animal that has, and I see it quite a bit with several of the bulls, they've got a polled Celtic gene. That's it's coming from probably a lowline or a Galloway. I think that may even be Highland in that family, that they fall under that polled Celtic. But that definitely is a clue that there's something other than Jersey in there if you see polled Celtic. And then Free Martin, the reason that that test is important is if you have a female who's very young, she's not breeding or she's not cycling, or things don't quite look right, or your vet says he thinks it may be a Free Martin, what that means is that she was a twin, either born with a twin, or the twin could have even been aborted early in the pregnancy and she was born without a twin, but was still exposed to male hormones at some point during her own gestation. And it makes it, for cows, it makes it so that they can't breed at all. And that's why you want to test for Free Martin, excuse me. And that sometimes happens if you buy a dairy coal. And there are other tests that your vet can do, but it's sometimes so far internal that they can't tell otherwise, but they can tell from their DNA. Yes. Papers can and parentage can be really helpful to be able to know exactly what bloodlines you're buying into. That's kind of the point of registration, but unfortunately, not all the registries require parental match. And a lot of times there's several of them, they don't require anything. So you could even end up with cattle that are not who the papers say they are. I've ran into that situation before with an unethical breeder that had cattle that he was boarding, and he sold the offspring with different names and papers from a registry that didn't require any DNA proof, which is why it is so important that we have colored pictures of both sides of the animal. We've been able to identify some of these animals that have had their names changed, whether it be someone bought them and changed their name for their own purposes, just because they wanted to be able to put it in their pedigree somehow or something. I'm not sure why people do that. It's really not how things are supposed to be handled. But they do change names. And if you've got colored pictures, sometimes you can find those markings and you can figure out, okay, that bull really is another bull that we're familiar with. So pictures and DNA are really important for that. All right, we ready to move on to genomics? That's where things really start getting good. So with genomics, for us to be able to access those, because we're talking about jerseys, we order those through the American Jersey Cattle Association. The way that you're going to do that is you need to get a membership number. So you call them, you get an account number. I believe it's a 6-digit number. And then you can go on to infojersey.com and create an account and then register your cattle. And that is a little tricky. You cannot register your cattle as polled unless they have a parent that's polled. They won't let you automatically do that. And if you're bringing in a new animal, they don't have a parent that's polled. So if you do the testing at UC Davis, you can have those results sent over by email directly from UC Davis. You go into the UC Davis website where you contact them, the contact form, and ask them to please email the American Jersey Cattle Association that information. I'm not sure about if Canadians can, Amy, honestly. I don't know why you couldn't. And they do have a really great database. I'm constantly looking information up there. I would call and ask them if that's a potential to be able to get membership as a Canadian with AJCA to access that. If not, you can always message me through Facebook or email and ask me to look something up for you, and I can get that to you. Neogen is not the same as UC Davis. That's a great question, though. So Neogen does the genomics, but they don't have the great database because so many mini Jersey breeders were already mapping their cattle through UC Davis. There are a lot of the older sires, like if you use Loyal, he's already in UC Davis, but he is not in the database for AJCA at all. So in a situation like that, it just makes sense that we need to go to UC Davis because that's where they're at. As we get further into PMJS and building more of a history and generations, those animals will be in the database then with Neogen that AJCA owns along with Neogen. So you would be able to access that there. Just like, for example, My Bull Vanguard is in AJCA. So when you do your genomics, it automatically will DNA match him as the sire to the animal that you're registering if that is an offspring. Okay. So how I've handled that in the past with asking for the national ID or a management number in the ear tag, those you do have to put in some sort of an ID. Because we're talking about mini jerseys and they're more of a boutique kind of a registry thing. We're not doing the ear tags that a lot of the commercial dairies do. So I put in my herd number, which is NW for Northwoods, and then the animal number, and it's an ongoing count. So I think I'm at 35 or 37 or something now. So it would be NW 37 in that ear tag spot. And then I don't actually put in an ear tag or a tracker or anything like that. Each animal does need to have their own number, and you need to know who that goes to. So if you keep paper files and keep track of that, that's all you need to do at this point. The federal government is pushing towards getting RFIDs in all of the cattle in the United States. It used to be that we could get the Bangs ear tag, and that would be a good tracking number. But the vet is really telling me that as time goes on, I need to expect that we'll have to have RFIDs. Canada is 100%. So if you sell an animal over the border, they do have to have that RFID tag to be able to enter the country. I hope that answers that question. Okay, so when you're logging in, that's one of those things you need to know. You can't put an animal in as polled unless they have a polled parent, but you can provide testing, and then they will alter that at a later date and show that that animal is polled. And that's where they get that the name next to the name. It'll have a -P or -PP. -P means that they carry one polled gene. So one of their parents passed a polled gene, whether it's polled Celtic or polled Frisian. And then if it's PP, that means that they inherited two. So each one of the parents, both of them passed a polled gene. So they could be polled Frisian on both sides of that, or they could be polled Celtic and polled Frisian. But PP means that they carry two. So none of their offspring then have horns because they are only able themselves to pass on a polled gene, and you only need one for the offspring to be polled and not need to be dehorned. The other thing is you have to put in the parentage, and there's generic codes that you can use for that. And if you hit up that, I don't have it directly in front of me, but I believe those are in, if you go to the website, purebredminijerseys.org, and you go to resources and drop down to the blog, there is an article there about how to register and the testing that's required. And I go into a lot more details about those actual specific codes that are used for the dam and the sire down the page, and it walks you through the process. So you can find that in the blog. So you'll put in those parents, and those are just generic, unknown, purebred Jersey is what those codes are for. I recommend doing that. And then if AJCA in their testing identifies that the animal is a cross, they'll put a JX in front of their name. Personally, and I know we're making this public, but personally, I don't volunteer that an animal is JX. I want the DNA to tell me if that's what the case is. So I use those generic codes that are for a purebred Jersey sire and a purebred Jersey dam. The other thing, let's see, what was it that you had a question about earlier, Corey? What to put in one of those spots in the registration?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. It sounds this is I think I just figured out. So you have to register the cow first with the American Jersey
Mhm.
before you can test them for the BBR and stuff. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then so then you can put that animal ID in after you've gotten your registration papers from them.
Yes, you don't even have to wait for the actual registration papers to come in the mail. As soon as you do your online registration through infojersey.com, they will issue you a registration number. So you can highlight that immediately. And then you go to the services tab in infojersey.com. You go to services, you go down to genomics, and then you go over to order genomic tests. And that's where you're going to enter that number that they just issued for your animal. And then you're going to choose, and we talked about this a little bit the other day, there are different levels of the genomic testing. The one that you want right now is the 100,000 allele test. So that's, I actually wrote it down here so you didn't forget, is the LD100K chip includes those breed specifics for jerseys. That test right now is running $47 for people that don't have the extra REAP program for AJCA. And we don't need that. We're not an actual dairy. We're a backyard farm, but we want to have high class cattle that are well bred. So the 100K chip right now is good enough. There are other levels. You can get one that's 9,000 different genes, different alleles, or you can get one that's $115, and I think that was 150,000 alleles. So right now, what I'm recommending is that LD 100,000 chip that has the SNPs, which are the different alleles that they're testing. So they're actually matching our cattle with 100,000 different alleles to the Jersey database of known pure Jersey cattle. So one of the arguments I've heard is that not all of the Jerseys or not all of the Jersey herds or not all the bloodlines are in the database. And so that's why some cattle are coming back as not being pure. And that's what JX means. They're a Jersey cross. But the database is so good. I don't believe that that's true at all. They have tested cattle from around the world. So that database includes New Zealand bloodlines, Australian bloodlines, the Isle bloodlines from the Isle of Jersey, bloodlines from all over the United States. And remember, all Jerseys come from the Isle of Jersey. So they are all related, whether it's that they're pure blood Jerseys or they're miniature Jerseys, they still have Jersey DNA. So there are 5 different breeds that the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding has done genomic testing for. So one of those is Jerseys, and then there are 4 other breeds that aren't. If they identify something that is not one of those 5 breeds, then they know that it's not one of these dairy breeds. That's when they're going to flag it as being not pure. So something like Dexter cattle that is probably fairly prolific through miniature Jerseys is not in the database. It's not a beef breed that's in the database, and it's also not a dairy breed. So that's, I think, when most of ours are getting flagged with something like a JX. For PMJS purposes, we don't worry a lot about that JX because we know that there's a lot of bloodlines that aren't pure. And honestly, we're not terribly worried about that because once we identify it, we can start working away from it. But it's when you don't know, and people contact me and they're like, my miniature Jersey's giving me a half a gallon to a gallon of milk. And my first question is, are they nursing a baby? No, that's her mass production. Like that's her peak is a gallon of milk a day. That's not normal for a Jersey, but it's very normal for a Dexter, and it's very normal for a Jersey Dexter cross, a 50-50, something like that. And if that's not what you thought you were buying, that's going to be really disappointing. So using that DNA to get that information kind of helps us to figure out what to expect. So if that's the case, start where you are. She's not junk. You still love her. She's still making you milk. But for the next generation, you might choose a bull that's going to give you more milk. And the way that you know that is through genomics. So when we test our cattle, we get back over 35 different data points. One of those is milk production. So because we're working with miniature cattle, we're not going to be, and the database is all made, remember you guys, for commercial dairy cattle. So they're expecting big milk, 8 gallons of milk, 7 gallons of milk. So you don't want to let those numbers scare you too much when you see that the milk production is negative 1,200, negative 600. That's because our cattle are proportionally smaller. They're going to produce less. I don't want 7 gallons of milk a day. I don't even know what I would do with 7 gallons of milk a day. And I don't have the time to make cheese like that every single day. So for me, that 2.5 gallons, 3 gallons of milk is perfect. A couple of days worth of milk, and I've got enough to make a batch of cheese or 2 batches of cheese even. It's plenty for me. So those numbers, we're looking for a negative stature and we're looking for some negative milk scores. There's information in there that gets so detailed as to even the foot angle. So how the hoof is hitting the ground, the angle of the legs, the angle of the hips. The legs are important because if you're live cover breeding, you want that animal to have some spring to be able to recover from being mounted or from mounting other cattle. Hip angle is important because with the right angle, if it's a little bit low, if the pins are slightly below the hip, she's going to have an easier time calving. If she's very swayed back and her pins are very high in comparison to her hip, it's going to be the wrong angle for the calf to come out because the calf is coming down. So if the pins are up, the calf has to go up and then down. And that's just not a natural way for calving, and it will slow things down and be really hard on her. So there's things like that that you learn from doing genomic testing that you just don't necessarily get otherwise. Once I started getting those results back and seeing not just my breed-based representation, the BBR score, which is the percent, I started being able to make choices about who I was breeding to based on the bulls that were also tested. And as that database grows for us as mini Jersey breeders, we can select for higher BBR for more Jersey, but we can make other little tweaks along the way to be able to produce the best cattle that we're able. So let's see, we've got a couple of questions here. Okay. What do you think about getting the beta casing test and pulled from AJCA when you do that genomic testing? That's a great question. They have the best price to be able to also do the A2. I believe it's running like $4 right now to add the A2 test on. Although if you do the polled, it's slightly more expensive than if you do the poll test over at UC Davis. But you save the hassle of moving your poll test over and asking UC Davis to send that for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
So
if
the
we were
A2,
going to register a new cow, and would you just send everything to the American Jersey and try to get those tests added on, and rather than try to do half at UC Davis and half here?
right, right. If you need to save a little money though, it is cheaper to do A2 at AJCA and pulled over at UC Davis. So like
Yeah.
it gets a little bit complicated. So I'm glad we've got this opportunity to sit down together and kind of cover
And
some
what
of
was
that
the
information.
JNS that they offer as a test?
So if the cattle come back as, I believe it's less than 90, BBR 90, they don't automatically do that. That's a splayed limb. It's a genetic defect, much like chondro. Um, the calves, when they're born, they can actually get their legs to function in the front, is my understanding, and they can never get up to where they can reach the udder to be able to nurse. It's something that they don't recover from. And it was identified fairly recently. So that is just now being offered, I would say, in the last 2 years.
Mhm.
There's also another neuropathy, I believe it's JHS, JH1, JH2. I can't recall off the top of my head, but there's several of them that automatically get tested for. But if the animal is less than 90 BBR, then they don't add that test on. So you can buy it separately if you're concerned about it, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's not something that we've seen in many jerseys. Okay. Do we have any questions from what we've covered so far with genetics or genomics that I haven't answered for you as we've gone along? Okay, perfect.
I have a I
Oh,
have a
yes,
quick question for you.
of course.
If the parents are one parent is PF for pulled and the other is PF and H, then all offspring will be pulled. But do we still need to test for it?
Okay, so how it works is each parent has two genes, right? So you're saying
Right.
that they each have one polled and one horned. So they can
No.
pass either one of
No,
those.
one parent has PF
Okay.
and
Okay.
the other has PF and H.
Okay. So in that situation, you know that they passed one polled and then the other one passed either polled or horned. So they could
Right.
have passed horned. So then you're
Oh,
going to have an offspring that is polled and horned. And the only reason that that matters is that half the time that is going to pass the horn gene and the other half it's going to pass the polled gene. So for
okay.
example, I think it was 2 years ago, I bred a polled horn to a polled horn and
Mhm.
expected I would get a polled calf because I had two parents, each of them expected to pass, one of them at least would pass the polled gene. It should be 50-50, 75-25, to be able to
Mhm.
get the polled. But what happened is both of those polled horned animals, they both passed their horn gene. So my
Okay.
offspring was horned and I was expecting it to be polled. And about I don't know, 3 days after she was born, I'm scratching on her little head and went, oh my gosh, there's horns there. I was surprised because I hadn't expected. Statistically, it's not as likely, but it does happen. So
So
in
still
that
go ahead
situation,
and test for that.
excuse me.
So still go ahead and test for that.
The reason that you might test for that, because so if they're horned, you're going to know it.
Right.
You're going to see horn buds definitely by about a month. But if you use paste, you need to know within about 24 to 36 hours and immediately react and treat them with paste.
Mhm.
If you do scoops or you leave horns, then you can deal with it at a later date. I prefer paste, so I do need to know right away. It's a good thing I caught it and I treated it that very day. But why I would recommend testing if you want to know those genetics is if your animal is polled, because they both passed polled genes, then every offspring that they have is polled, and that is more valuable. When I'm pricing my animals, I give that at about a $500 value for an animal to have the polled gene, whether it be polled or single polled. But polled is ideal because all of their offspring are polled. And so that makes them easier to sell. It makes them, when you're making choices about breeding, you may even choose to use a bull that is, let's see, I can't think off the top of my head, but there are some bulls that are, Gus, for example, was dehorned. So you could use some genetics like that maybe aren't quite as common, because you know that animal, your heifer, cow, if it's a female, would be able to produce a polled offspring for you.
Okay. Thank
Right.
you.
Polled is not a required test though for registering. Neither is A2. At this point, that's not going to be required. What we're looking for is not to bring in chondroplasia. And we're looking for animals that are matched to their parents. And the date of that actually being required is any animals born after January 1st of 2020. That was put into place before things went crazy that year, that would be, those animals are still alive, those parents are still alive, and we all know that we should be DNA matching to our offspring so that future generations, as we keep matching, then our pedigrees are accurate, which is really important for a registry. That's the point of registries. So if they aren't parental matched or if they're inaccurate, then the registry is not doing their job. It really should be done with every generation. So we're laying that foundation so that we're handling things properly. Okay. Is that all the questions about what we covered for genetics and genomics before we move on to diseases? Okay. So diseases. When we're talking about our miniatures, the prices can be $2,500. I've seen all the way up to $12,000. That's a huge investment, with the average median price being somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 for a mini Jersey. So you want to make sure that the money that you're spending is a good investment. So that's why I would recommend before you buy an animal that you do disease testing. If you're buying a very young heifer, she's not going to have those diseases usually manifesting yet. So if it's possible, if she's under 6 months old, it's best to test the dam for those things. For example, BLV, bovine leukosis virus, BV, bovine viral diarrhea. And you think that that's probably, loose stool. It's not something you really have to worry about, but it actually can make them infertile. And then you've got a $6,000 lawn ornament that can't produce milk for you anymore. So things like Yonis is a wasting disease. You may not even realize she's got it. What's really scary about Yonis is they get exposed typically in the first month of life. It can be in utero, but it's most common after, in either the birthing fluids or manure gets on the udder and the calf nurses the udder, and that gets exposed that way. And then that animal has that sitting in their intestine for as long as 6 to 7 years sometimes, before it actually starts to take hold and really get overwhelming for the animal, and they can't deal with it anymore. And that's when you start noticing that there's something going on wrong. She's losing weight. She's got really violently loose stool, and she's really suffering. At that point, she's infected all of her calves that have been around her, possibly even the last couple of calves, any calves that come in contact with her. Usually adult animals are able to fight that off, and so it's not as dangerous for them, unless those were her calves. And that is scary to me, because that could mean that the last 3 calves she was shedding and I didn't realize it. So that's one that I test for every year. Those things can get really expensive if you're testing the whole herd every year. I test my cows every year when they come into milk. And the reason for that is because I know I'll be rebreeding them, right? And I want to make sure that I'm protecting my family as well as protecting my future calves. So what I found about, 6, 7 years ago, you can test the milk, and you can even send blood samples if you know how to collect them to places like Central Star, Armor Animal Health Labs, Sage Ag Labs. Several of the universities that have an ag department can do testing for you. They're usually more expensive. So I'd run mine through Armor Animal Health. I run a milk sample and send that in, and it costs me about $3 to $5 per test. I can run a full mastitis, infectious mastitis panel, and that'll include things like Mycoplasma, Neospora, Staph A, which we know is MRSA. And that is something that people can catch. It's environmental, it is around, but once it gets in the udder, it's really hard to get rid of. Most of those animals are cold. So if you're buying a calf, a heifer, for example, or even a bull, and you're going to bring them onto your property, you want to make sure that he's not carrying or she's not carrying something that's going to spread to the rest of your herd or get into your soil, because some things will live in your soil, especially if you live in a warmer environment. I'm North Idaho. It's pretty cold here. Winters kill a lot of different viruses. And, like the last week, it's been negative 25. So there's not a whole lot that can survive that for any length of time. Yeah, down in Florida, you don't have that. Yeah, but that doesn't happen where it's warm like that. There's a lot of things like BLV and BVD that are just rampant, and once you bring it onto your property, you're kind of stuck. So you can pre-screen your animals. You can ask. I like personally when I'm buying an animal, which I haven't done in a long time. I closed my herd about 6-7 years ago. You can contact the vet for the person that you're buying from. You want to talk to their vet. You want to, if you can, personally hire that vet. Then they report the results of the test back to you because they are working for you in that situation. So there's no disclosure issues with that then, because you are the one that hired them. You're the one that's paying their bills. They will tell you. So if for any reason you feel like maybe the seller isn't being ethical, you can protect yourself kind of that way by being the one that hires the vet. If it's somebody that like I've sold to friends a lot of times, they'll still hire the vet to come out and do the testing so that they've got it themselves, and then they can use that when they sell the animal. Like they got that paper trail that they've created that the animal was healthy when they bought it, and is healthy again once they go to sell it. Because some things, like we talked about, Yonis is so sneaky, it will spike and you'll have some problems with it, and then it'll kind of taper off, and maybe the animal's doing a little better. So maybe the weather was really cold and she was struggling, and so it starts to take hold and gets kind of bad, but then she's doing better and it warms up and she's back on her feet and everything is good, and it could kind of hide and you won't necessarily know, which is why a fecal for that situation is really good, because it catches, because it's intestinal, it'll catch it. It's a lot more sensitive. BVD, Yonis, and BLV is the other one. BVD, BLV, and Yonis are the ones that I test for every year. If you're buying from a herd that has small ruminants like goats or sheep, Q fever is also infectious to people. So that's one I would recommend that you test for. The list of tests. Oh, okay. So basically, when you buy an animal, you at least want to be testing for BLV, BVD, Yonis. If they've got small ruminants, you want to test for Q fever. If there's milk that you can test, like if it's a cow that's in milk, or you're buying a heifer and the dam is still in milk, I would do an infectious mastitis panel, which includes things like Mycoplasma, Neospora, and Staph A. Those are the ones that I am most worried about, because those a lot of times will pass to people. They may not have the same names in people, but they can pass to people a lot of times. So Yonis is considered Crohn's if people have it. So that's one of those ones that they say that it doesn't necessarily get into people, but there is a human equivalent. So there's a little bit of hesitation there that maybe that really does. And there's even a whole website, and a lot of doctors are researching it, lab doctors. Yonis.org, I believe is what that's called for that particular one. So brucellosis and TB are federally regulated. Those are ones that you have to test for typically when they're crossing property or state lines rather. But the United States very recently is considered brucellosis free. Most states have that status as being brucellosis free. I believe all 50 do now, even Montana, which was where the problem was located. So Idaho had it mandatory that you had to do the bangs vaccine because of that. But my understanding is that status has very recently changed, and that we may not be required to do the bangs vaccine anymore. Personally, I don't like my family milk cow to have the bangs vaccine, because once they have it, they can test false positive. And then when that happens, you don't know if they are actually exposed to it and have an active infection, or if it's the vaccine itself telling you that they'd been exposed to it through the vaccination, and that's why they're showing those numbers. So I prefer not to vaccinate my own cows that I'm keeping here on the property for my family, because I want to be able to test them and know what that vaccine actually does is it doesn't protect them from being infected. It protects them from the abortion that's caused by the infection. And it was developed because beef herds were losing a lot of their calves. Their pregnancies were not going through, and that's expensive. They lose a lot of money that way if the herd's infected. So the federal government stepped in, just like they did with TB, and they control all of the testing and all of the quarantine and destroying any animals that are infected in those situations. So those, honestly, even though they're the ones that are federally regulated, are not the ones that I worry about, because we already know that those are being eradicated to a very high amount. I have not heard of any infections in a long time. Does that help? Does that answer your questions, Corey, about what I would test for personally?
Yeah, thank you. I think I wrote them all down, so but I'll have to listen to this again so I can catch all of them. So
Okay. I believe it's also on the website. If you go to resources and then you scroll down to types of testing, and it kind of breaks down like this worksheet does, the different kinds of testing and the different things
thank
to
you.
test for.
That would
If
be
you really
helpful.
want to go
Thank
off
you
the
for
deep
that.
end, I've got, I think it's 32 or 35 different diseases that we've tested for personally in my herd. And I did list all those out, a lot of them with links on my website. And those would be on, it's nwhomestead.com. And on the available cattle page, if you scroll down, there'll be a list of all of the tests that we've done. Some of those only apply to bulls because we're producing bulls for export internationally. Some of those tests, that's why they're there. They wouldn't necessarily all apply, but you can definitely see that crazy long list of what we've invested in for testing.
Thank you.
Yes, it is very similar to the way that Merrick's works, Gigi, when they do the vaccination for bangs. So I think we've covered everything, and I think we've answered all the questions. I was hoping to keep this right at about 45 minutes. So I want to thank you guys again for being here. Thank you for helping us create this educational video for people to be able to share. And we'll have it uploaded for you very soon on YouTube. So thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being lifetime members of PMJS.